Dean Merit Journal, Professor Bhagwati, Ambassador Sarna, Dr. Panigriya, distinguished members of the faculty and friends. It's always a pleasure to be at Columbia. I recollect that the first time I was invited probably to this very room was in 2013 when we were in government, when we were in opposition, sorry. And there was a likelihood of being in government shortly. And the last time I was here when the Deepak and the Neera Raj Center was launched somewhere in one of the beautiful open spaces outside at a similar meeting which was held a few years ago. I remember when I had first come here in 2013, and obviously then in opposition, we were analyzing as to what were the challenges and the problems which were ailing India's economy at that time. And one of the principal issues, amongst the principal issues which we had raised was with regard to both the inability of the political leadership to take decisions, the inability to decide what the direction really has to be, and their inability really to get out of controversies which really create a hurdle in the decision-making process. One's credibility is lost because of all kinds of allegations of collateral motives, corruptions. Then your credibility itself suffers, and in developing economies it happens all the more. It was therefore a challenge before us to establish the credibility of the decision-making process of the Indian economy itself. And in order to establish that credibility, one of the important challenges obviously had been that you must have both in terms of speed, a quick decision-making process. You must have an ability to even take tougher decisions, and you must have a complete clarity about the direction in which you want. Democracies obviously have their limitations because several decisions have to go through Parliament, and parliaments have their own timetables to determine because of the prevailing political situation. And keeping that in mind, I can today look back and say that consistently this was the policy of the Prime Minister and the government. At regular interval, one after the other, a lot of unfinished tasks with regard to decision-making in the Indian economy had to be done. And therefore, one after the other, each one of those decisions really is being taken. I can't say that the task is anywhere near completion. In a process of this kind, there will never be a finishing line. And therefore, one really has to have a clarity about the direction in which we want to move. And we must resist the temptation of ever moving in a contrarian direction. The Indian model now seems to be emerging. I think one thing is absolutely clear to most close observers of India, that when we started our reform process in 1991, we probably started it some decades late. But having started it few decades late, the direction that we followed probably was a direction which has helped India considerably, and therefore any form of debate, discussion or suggestions to go back to more regulation, to go back to stricter controls, not to integrate yourself itself, I think we've been in the process of dispelling any notion of that kind. If we look at, there were some decisions which were relatively easier for a government to take. Amongst easier decisions are decisions with regard to investment. Most of them don't require a parliamentary approval. In fact, in our case, only the insurance required a parliamentary approval. And one of the great debates when we took over was, there are a large number of companies internationally used to look up and ask us the question. I remember when I came here in 2014 or 15, I was asked a question, are you going to increase the FDI in insurance? That seemed to be the key issue. That now looks like a small minor reform which took place. And thereafter, consistently we looked at sector after sector. We convinced public opinion in India that domestic investment in India is grossly inadequate. What you require is additionality of evidence, and therefore we have to create an environment in India where people find India a friendly place to invest in. What were the hurdles? The first hurdle was that our doors were too narrow, our limits didn't allow them. The second hurdle was, even when we allowed them, between the decision to start businesses in India and the eventual commencement of business, you could spend years and years before you got your permissions. Your tax legislations were unclear, and you could be visited with a liability in India, a retrospective liability. And therefore it was quite a challenging task to convince investors all over the world who now regarded India as having fallen off the global radar at that time. In fact, I remember some of the leading economic magazines doing a story titled, "Will I Fall Off the Bricks?" I was being almost written off. And therefore, to restore back the credibility at that stage was extremely important. Now, on that front, if you actually test each one of those cases, in sector after sector, where there was a scope for opening up, we opened up. And I must say that in not one case, as is expected in developing economies, did we face a protest. I had actually kept my fingers crossed when I announced that normally in defense we would allow foreign investment. Defense was something which was being considered sacrosanct. And we would, in case where some special technologies come in, there would be no limits as far as that investment cap is concerned. We were watching the reactions. This was coupled with an argument that look at us today as the largest buyers of defense equipment in the world, going to foreign companies, foreign governments, spending foreign exchange. Why can't we request those companies to partner Indian companies and start manufacturing in India? And that's what the strategic partner policy, which I formulated in my brief spell as a defense minister, really indicates. That we now allow Indian companies certain platforms to be made exclusively by private sector. Indian companies who are entitled to enter into their tie-ups with foreign companies, and that's a process which now seems to have started off on the right track itself. And therefore, one after the other, in sectors which were not opened up, we opened them up. Whatever were the conditionalities attached to that investment, a lot of those conditionalities were redundant. We removed those conditionalities. And then we realized that 95% of all investment coming into India was actually coming by the automatic route. And therefore, for 5%, we had a regulatory mechanism of the Foreign Investment Promotion Board. So you first come to your respective ministry, then you come to the board, you ask for multiple permissions, first by your ministry, then by your board. And this year I announced we are abolishing the board altogether. And therefore, if you are in a regulated sector, that 5%, you go directly to the ministry and they will regulate it. The result is that we became one of the largest recipients of foreign direct investment in India in this brief period. You then had to tackle this whole question: how do you create an environment which gives a comfort to the foreign investor? And let alone to the international investor, what gives a comfort to the domestic investor itself. A lot of people who have made investments in India found that the investments had been blocked up, the environment was not congenial, some technical objections, some taxation problems, etc. And worst of all, there was serious stigma that in developing economies, including India, corruption was a great disincentive as far as investment was concerned. And therefore, you needed to wipe out that image, at least of political corruption as far as the government of India is concerned. And I can say with a sense of comfort, we've greatly succeeded in doing that. And there were essentially two areas which gave rise to that corruption. One was extraordinary amount of discretions vested in the government. Now, when ministers exercise discretion, you will have possible investors visiting them, people asking for favors. So the minister has the power to allocate call blocks, he has the power to decide the cost of spectrum, he has the power to use his discretion as to who gets an iron ore mine. I think all this required to be taken away from ministerial discretions and be left to a market mechanism. This required in several cases a change of law. And of course, with the strong public opinion backing it, a change of law was not very difficult. The second area, and I regret to say which still remains, is the world's largest democracy lacking transparent sources of political funding. And that's the second source. So this year in my budget speech, I addressed that. And I have given a formulation of people being entitled to buy electoral bonds through banking instruments and then donating those electoral bonds which can only be encashed by a political party. We are still in the process of working out all the formalities with the concerned institutions, and hopefully very soon it could see the light of day itself. And therefore it was extremely important to address these two important areas itself. The third, of course, was taxation. No retrospective tax, we had announced. We didn't implement it. What do we do about the former ones? Assessments have been made. There were several suggestions made that you change the law. We came out with changes in law which allowed scope for settlement. And we left it to the judicial process to continuously decide. And most of those disputes, barring one or two, have gradually resolved themselves out. One or two remain. And I do hope that either by a judicial process or by a settlement, which is now statutorily provided in law itself, those could be settled out. India's direct taxes needed to be reformed. So two important changes I'll just refer to. One is eliminate, to the extent possible, the interface between an assessing officer and an assessee. So today, most people in India, almost all, file their returns online. Queries are addressed to them online. 99% of them receive their assessment orders online. So they don't go to the tax office ever. A few cases, because India is still a tax non-compliant society in many ways, some of those cases come up for scrutiny, but I can tell you the number of cases I've checked up year after year, the figure which come up for scrutiny now has come down to 1% of the total returns filed. And therefore that figure itself has come down quite radically itself. The next big challenge which Professor Panigria just referred to was the goods and services tax. we have central government, state governments charging multiple taxes. Each assessment added to the cost. At each stage of tax, there was tax on tax. And therefore, the costs multiplied. There was multiple interface with assessing authorities. And therefore, to perceive of a common taxation system across the country, which would allow a free flow of goods and commodities across the country, goods and services, was needed. How do you build a political consensus? I must say it was difficult. But at the end of the day, I would give full credit also to the states in India, which realized that they would be the eventual beneficiaries. And therefore, even when their parent political parties were talking a different language, the state governments all acted in tandem. And one after the other, each one of them started supporting it. The result was very obvious that we could pass the Constitution Amendment, we could pass the multiple legislations. And I would say today, after 3 months of its implementation, we have an effective functioning council in place, a council where there is, which is India's first federal institution, which decides by unanimity. And as we are going through the whole process of initial days, we are also learning our lessons. And one of the lessons which we are learning is, of course, there are problems which arise from time to time which need to be corrected, that it's still the top taxpayers who pay most of the tax. The large bottom pays marginal amounts, and therefore their compliance burdens itself needs to be significantly reduced itself. And I see as it will go on for days and months to come, we see an important movement in the direction where the base itself is increasing. The process will be much simpler, and like the direct tax, most of the assessments and the compliances will be online. The interaction between the assessing officer and the assessee itself would gradually become extremely negligible itself. The IBC is an important challenge, the insolvency and the banking code. There are businesses which thought that, well, you can continue to collect money from banks and not have to repay it. And during the boom period and thereafter, there was mindless lending. And we've tried various experiments through the central bank restructuring formulations, not very successful. And therefore, we've reached a situation where we realized that it was not possible for the system to go on. The IBC is early days, and I'm looking at some early harvest as far as the IBC is concerned, in order to make sure that the banks can realize some money, and we have an institutional mechanism in place so that a proper exit policy as far as these non-performing assets is concerned is offered. One big reform which has taken place is the technology-based Aadhaar platform. The Aadhaar platform gives to every Indian the unique identity, and today the transfer of all state support has already become substantially into the bank accounts itself. And this experiment is going to continue to expand. This has also resulted in eliminating leakages, targeting the eventual beneficiaries, and making sure that the most deserving get the benefit directly without any leakage into their bank accounts. Today you have millions and millions of people who have the benefit of this. We've had highly successful programs like the Financial Inclusion Program, where you had 300 million Indians who didn't have access to the banking system, who now have access to the banking system. And therefore, these are areas which seem to be moving on the strength of the technology base in the right direction. Investment in infrastructure year after year is being stepped up. And therefore, today we have, and during the interaction, and I'm going to leave a lot of substantial time for interaction itself, and keeping my opening remarks short, we have, whether it's the railways, or it's the airports, or it's the airlines, or it's the seaports, the highways, year after year, we've stepped up the largest possible expenditure we can make as far as infrastructure is concerned. And the second area has been the rural infrastructure, conventionally neglected. So what is the India we are looking at? We are looking at an India where every village gets connected to a road. A village has a paka house. Every house has a sanitation facility. Every village has electricity. And under the new scheme we've announced, by 2019, within that electrified village, every home has an electric connection. So that the benefit of the growth can really percolate down to the rural areas where you require these people to really move up. Of course, there's the big issue, and I think in the course of the discussion that will follow, I'll deal with it in details. The consistent steps we've taken to formalize and expand the more formal economy as far as India is concerned. And wanting to formalize that economy, one after the other steps against shadow economy, and finally culminating into the demonetization, which I do firmly believe has been a very positive step in the process of shaking what was the conventional Indian normal of continuing to deal as far as cash is concerned. Some of these steps, the demonetization, the GST, because the GST could lead to destocking of existing stocks, can have for a quarter or so a transient impact on manufacturing. But in the long run, these are institutional reforms, these are structural changes, and these structural changes, I think, put the Indian economy on a far more sounder track so that we can look forward for a much cleaner, much bigger Indian economy in the days and years to come.